The grand ballroom of the St. Regis was a cavern of gold leaf and crystal, a place where the air itself seemed filtered through currency before it was allowed to touch human lungs, and beneath the ambient hum of string quartets and polite laughter lay the predatory silence of sharks circling a wounded seal. Imagine standing on the edge of a cliff, but the cliff is made of marble, and the fall isn't physical, but social, financial, and permanent. If you have ever had to smile while your world was crumbling behind your eyes, leave a like. And if you know the weight of carrying a legacy that feels too heavy for your shoulders, comment resilience below, because this is the story of how dignity can scream louder than money. Simone stood before the floor-to-length mirror in the suite that the company credit card could barely cover, her fingers trembling slightly as they smoothed the fabric of the deep, royal purple dress that clung to her silhouette like a second skin. It was sleeveless, exposing arms that felt too fragile to hold up the empire her father had left behind, the silk cascading down to the floor in a pool of violet darkness that contrasted sharply with the sterile, beige luxury of the hotel room. She looked the part of the billionaire heiress the tabloids claimed she was: poised, sculptural, the epitome of modern royalty, but the reflection lied. The bank notification on her phone, currently face down on the mahogany vanity, told the truth, a negative balance that made her chest tighten with a suffocating, bone-deep panic. Coffee first. Always coffee first. But there was no coffee, only the bitter taste of anxiety. She wasn't just here to be seen, she was here to beg, though they called it securing capital in these circles. The legacy of the monolithic tech firm her father built was hanging by a thread, dismantled by bad investments and corporate vultures who smelled blood in the water the moment the funeral flowers wilted. Simone took a breath, holding it until her lungs burned, forcing her heart rate to slow, forcing the terrifying reality of her financial ruin into a small, dark box in the back of her mind. She applied her lipstick, a shade of defiance, and stared into her own dark eyes. "You're not broken. You're just bending." Tonight was the test. Tonight, she had to walk into the lion's den, wearing purple silk like armor, and convince the very men trying to destroy her that she was untouchable. The sensory assault of the gala was immediate and overwhelming, a tidal wave of clinking crystal, overpowering floral arrangements that smelled of funeral parlors, and the heavy, cloying scent of expensive cologne mixed with the metallic tang of ambition. The lights were too bright, illuminating every pore, every flaw, demanding perfection from those who walked the plush crimson carpet. Simone moved through the crowd with a practiced grace, her head high, her gait fluid, but inside, she was screaming. Every hand that reached out to shake hers felt cold, every smile felt like a baring of teeth, and the whispers that trailed in her wake were like little daggers finding the chinks in her armor. She was the ice queen to them, the failing daughter, the diversity higher in her own family tree. She grabbed a flute of champagne from a passing tray, not to drink, but to have something to hold, a prop to keep her hands from betraying her nervousness. The room was a sea of black tuxedos and glittering gowns, a mesmerizing display of wealth that felt grotesque when she knew she had to choose between paying the legal retainers or the property tax on the estate next month. Then she saw him. Preston. The man who represented everything wrong with this world. He stood near the center of the room, holding court, his laugh too loud, his teeth too white, surrounded by sycophants who laughed on cue. Preston was the one leading the hostile takeover, the one who had called her sweetheart in the boardroom and suggested she sell the company for scraps and go on a permanent vacation. He spotted her, his eyes narrowing into slits of amusement, raising his glass in a mock toast that felt like a slap across the face from across the room. The air grew thinner. The walls of the ballroom, adorned with frescoes of triumphant gods, seemed to lean in, judging her. She could feel the financial countdown ticking in her head, the numbers scrolling down, the looming deadline of the quarter end. She wasn't an heiress tonight. She was a gladiator with a dull sword, stepping into the arena against a man with a machine gun, and the only thing keeping her upright was the terrifying, beautiful stubbornness of a daughter protecting her father's name. The noise became a physical weight, pressing down on her clavicles, so Simone slipped away, seeking the sanctuary of the terrace, where the cool night air promised a momentary truce with her anxiety. The heavy glass doors muffled the cacophony of the gala, reducing the orchestra to a dull thrum, and she walked to the stone balustrade, gripping the rough, cold surface until her knuckles turned the color of ivory. The city sprawled out below her, a grid of electricity and indifference, millions of lights representing millions of lives that didn't care about stock prices or board votes. It was beautiful and lonely. "The view is better when you don't look down," a voice said, deep, resonant, and calm, startling her not with volume, but with its proximity. She turned sharply, her purple dress swirling around her ankles, to find a man standing in the shadows of a large potted olive tree. He was Korean, dressed in a tuxedo that fit him with a lethal precision, the fabric absorbing the light rather than reflecting it. He held a tumbler of amber liquid, his posture relaxed but carrying an underlying tension, like a coiled spring or a resting tiger. This was Junho. He didn't look like the other men inside. There was no desperation in his eyes, no hunger for approval, only a stillness that felt dangerous and safe all at once. He wasn't looking at her dress or her jewelry. He was looking at her hands, the way she gripped the stone. "I prefer looking up," Simone replied, her voice steady despite the adrenaline spiking in her veins. "Looking down reminds you of how far you can fall." Junho swirled his drink, the ice clinking softly, a sound far more pleasant than the brittle laughter inside. "Falling is inevitable," he said, stepping into the sliver of moonlight, revealing a face of sharp angles and eyes that held a dark, ancient intelligence. "It is the landing that matters."
And you?
"You look like someone who is tired of bracing for impact." It was a violation of social protocol, a stranger speaking so intimately to her, yet it was the most honest thing anyone had said to her in months. He didn't know her name, or perhaps he did, and didn't care about the titles attached to it. For a moment, amidst the scent of jasmine and city exhaust, Simone felt the heavy mantle of heiress slip, revealing the exhausted woman beneath. She couldn't stay on the balcony forever. The absence of the guest of honor would be noted, and weakness was blood in the water. With a nod of silent acknowledgement to the stranger, whose dark eyes lingered on her with an unreadable expression, Simone returned to the suffocating brilliance of the ballroom. The dinner was being served, a parade of plates carrying food too artistic to be appetizing, portions so small they mocked the hunger of the staff serving them. Simone found her assigned seat at the head table, a placement intended to honor her, but which felt more like being placed in the stocks. To her right sat a senator's wife who spoke only of her horses. To her left, an empty chair that was soon filled by Preston, who had switched placards to torment her. The audacity was breathtaking. He sat down with a heavy sigh, spreading his legs, taking up space, invading her personal sphere with a scent of scotch and arrogance. "Rough night, Simone?" he asked, his voice low, pitched so only she could hear the venom. "You look weary." "The dress is lovely, though. Very regal. A proper mourning color for the end of a dynasty." Simone picked up her silver fork, the metal cold and hard, grounding her. "The company isn't dead, Preston," she whispered, refusing to look at him, focusing on the pristine white tablecloth. "We had a profitable quarter projected," Preston chuckled, a wet, ugly sound. "Projected? That's the word for dreams, darling. The board is meeting Monday. I have the votes. You're out. I'm going to chop up your daddy's legacy and sell it for parts. And you? You'll be just another pretty face on the charity circuit." The cruelty was bone deep. It wasn't business. It was domination. He wanted to see her break. He wanted tears. He wanted the public vindication of destroying the woman who dared to think she could play in the big leagues. Simone felt the tears pricking the back of her eyes, hot and humiliating, but she swallowed them down, turning them into a hard, cold knot in her stomach. The climax of her humiliation arrived with the dessert course. The waiters were clearing the plates when Preston stood up, tapping his spoon against his glass, the sharp, piercing sound silencing the room instantly. 1,000 eyes turned toward them. "Ladies and gentlemen," Preston boomed, his voice projecting with the ease of a man who owns the room. "I'd like to propose a toast." Simone froze. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. "To new beginnings," Preston continued, his smile stretching wide, predatory. "And to knowing when to step aside." It's no secret that our dear Simone here has been struggling. The room gasped, a collective intake of breath that sucked the oxygen out of the air. This was it. The public execution. Rumor has it, Preston sneered, looking down at her, that she's even looking for a loan tonight to pay the catering bill. Is that true, sweetheart? Should we pass a hat around? The laughter that followed was scattered, nervous, but it was there. The humiliation washed over Simone, hot and suffocating. She couldn't move. She couldn't speak. She was the purple statue, frozen in shock, stripped of her dignity in front of the city's elite. Preston reached for a bottle of red wine on the table, feigning a stumble, and the dark liquid sloshed out, splashing onto the pristine tablecloth and splattering the hem of her dress. "Oops," he said, devoid of apology. "Clumsy me. Looks like you're stained, Simone." Permanently, the silence that followed was absolute. Simone stared at the red stains spreading on the purple silk, a visual representation of her bleeding heart. She was alone. Truly, utterly alone. Then, the heavy double doors at the back of the room swung open with a definitive thud. The rhythm of the room shifted. A temperature drop. Walking down the center aisle, ignoring the gasps, moving with the terrifying calm of a storm front, was the man from the balcony.
Jonah.
He didn't look at the crowd. He didn't look at Preston. His eyes were locked on Simone, and for the first time that night, the air in the room didn't feel like it belonged to the billionaires. It belonged to him. The silence that Junho commanded was not the silence of a library or a church. It was the silence of a predator entering a clearing, where every lesser creature instinctively freezes to avoid detection. He moved with a languid, terrifying fluidity, his tuxedo jacket unbuttoned to reveal the sharp, crisp lines of a white shirt that seemed to glow under the ballroom's unforgiving chandeliers. He did not rush. A man who owns time has no need to run. Simone watched him approach, her breath caught in a painful hitch within her throat, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against the silk of her ruined dress. Preston, emboldened by the alcohol and the adrenaline of his cruelty, sneered, though the expression faltered at the edges as Junho stepped into his personal space. The air temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. Junho didn't look at Preston's face. He looked at the wine stain on Simone's dress, his expression shifting from impassive to something darker, a simmering protectiveness that felt like a physical caress from across the distance. "I believe," Junho said, his voice a low baritone that vibrated through the floorboards, carrying effortlessly to the back of the room without him ever raising it, "that you have something that belongs to me." Preston laughed, a nervous, barking sound. "And who are you? The valet? Did I block your car?" The insult hung in the air, heavy and stupid. Junho finally lifted his gaze to meet Preston's, and the effect was instant. Preston took a half step back, his survival instinct finally overriding his arrogance. "I am the man who just bought the debt you are holding over her head," Junho said, his tone conversational, as if discussing the weather. He reached into his inner pocket. Preston flinched, and pulled out a pristine white handkerchief. He turned his back on Preston completely, dismissing him as one dismisses a gnat, and faced Simone. "Turn around," he whispered softly. Simone obeyed, mesmerized, and he began to gently dab at the wine stain on her dress, his knuckles grazing her hip, sending electric shocks through her numbness. The intimacy of the act, a man kneeling to clean a woman's dress in the middle of a ballroom, was more scandalous than any shout. He stood up, placing a hand on the small of her back, a brand of possession and support. He looked at the room, his eyes sweeping over the gawking elites. "She's with me," he declared, the words simple, final, and absolute. "And anyone who wishes to disrespect her will answer to the K-Corp Syndicate." The name hit the room like a bomb. Glasses stopped midair, whispers died. He wasn't just wealthy, he was the power that the wealthy feared. The walk from the ballroom to the hotel entrance was a blur of adrenaline and sensory overload, a tunnel vision where the only reality was the heat of Junho's hand on her lower back, guiding her, shielding her from the prying eyes that were now filled with fear rather than judgment. They burst out into the cool night air, the humidity of the city wrapping around them like a wet blanket, but it felt cleaner than the conditioned air inside. A sleek, black sedan idled at the curb, its windows tinted to an abysmal darkness. The driver, a man with a scar running down his jaw, opened the door before they even reached it. Junho ushered her inside, the interior smelling of leather and cedar, a masculine sanctuary that felt miles away from her crumbling life. As the door thudded shut, sealing them in a cocoon of silence, the adrenaline crashed. Simone began to shake, a violent, uncontrollable trembling that started in her hands and seized her entire frame. The shame, the fear, the exhaustion of holding up the sky for so long, it all collapsed. She covered her face with her hands, trying to stifle the sob that clawed its way up her throat. She didn't want to cry in front of him, this dangerous stranger who had saved her, but she was shattered. Then, she felt it, a hesitant, gentle weight settling over her shoulders. Junho had removed his tuxedo jacket and draped it over her. He didn't speak immediately. He simply waited, allowing her the dignity of her breakdown. When her breathing finally hitched and slowed, he reached into a small cooler in the center console and produced a bottle of water, cracking the seal with a sharp snap. "Drink," he commanded, but the harshness was gone from his voice, replaced by a quiet solicitude. Simone took the bottle, her fingers brushing his. His skin was warm, calloused, working hands hidden in a billionaire's suit. "Why?" she asked, her voice cracking, sounding small in the dark cabin. "Why did you do that?" "You don't even know me." Junho looked out the window at the passing city lights, the neon streaking across his angular features. "I know enough," he murmured. "I watched you on the balcony. You were holding onto that stone like it was the only thing keeping you from the earth. I know what it looks like when someone is fighting a war in their own head. And I despise bullies." He turned to her, his dark eyes locking onto hers, intense and searching. "And, perhaps, I wanted to know the woman who wears purple armor to a slaughter." The car didn't take her home. It took her to the skyline, specifically to a penthouse that looked down on the city from a vantage point only gods and gargoyles usually enjoyed. The elevator ride up was thick with a tension that was no longer fear, but a magnetic pull that made Simone's skin prickle. When the doors opened, the apartment was vast, minimalist, and bathed in the soft glow of floor lamps that highlighted heavy oak furniture and walls of glass. It was a fortress of solitude. Junho led her to a sprawling leather sofa and poured 2 glasses of amber liquid, a rare vintage whiskey that smelled of smoke and history. He sat opposite her, not too close, respecting her space, yet his presence filled the room. "We have work to do," he said, shifting from the savior to the strategist. "Preston thinks he has won because he humiliated you. He thinks you are emotional, weak. We will use that." Simone took a sip of the whiskey, the burn grounding her. "I have no capital, Junho. My accounts are frozen. The lawyers are circling." She felt the familiar shame rising, but he cut it off with a sharp gesture of his hand. "Money is just numbers," he scoffed. "Power is perception. I bought your debt tonight, yes. But I didn't do it to own you. I did it to partner with you." He leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees, his face inches from hers. "I have read your designs. The blueprints for the sustainable housing grid your father started? They are brilliant. You are not a figurehead, Simone. You are the architect. And I need an architect." The validation hit her harder than the rescue. For years, men had looked at her and seen a face, a dress, a diversity quota. Junho looked at her and saw her mind. A spark of attraction, hot and undeniable, flared in her chest. It wasn't just gratitude anymore. "So," she whispered, leaning in, drawn into his orbit. "What's the plan?" Junho smiled, and this time, it reached his eyes, crinkling the corners. It was a devastatingly handsome expression. "We let him think he's the king," he said softly. "And then, at the board meeting, we show him that he is merely standing on a trapdoor." But first he reached out, his thumb brushing a stray tear from her cheek, his touch lingering, electric. "First, you need to remember who you are. You are not the victim. You are the queen on the board." The days leading up to the board meeting were a blur of strategy sessions, late-night coffees, and a growing, unspoken intimacy that filled the air between them like static electricity. They worked out of his penthouse, surrounded by papers, schematics, and empty takeout containers. Simone saw the man behind the myth. Junho wasn't just a mafia boss. He was a man who had clawed his way up from nothing, who valued loyalty and competence above all else. And he saw her. Not the heiress, but the woman who could calculate load-bearing stresses in her head and who took her coffee black and bitter. The morning of the meeting, the sky was a bruised purple, matching the mood of the impending confrontation. Simone dressed in a sharp, white suit this time. No more morning colors. She felt armored, not by silk, but by the confidence Junho had reignited in her. They arrived at her company's headquarters together. The whispers started the moment they walked into the lobby, but Simone didn't look down. She looked up. Ready? Junho asked as they stood before the heavy double doors of the boardroom. He didn't offer to go in for her. He offered to stand beside her. Ready, she said, and she meant it. They pushed the doors open. Preston was already sitting at the head of the table, his feet up on the mahogany, laughing with two other board members. The laughter died instantly. Simone. Preston sneered, though his eyes darted nervously to Junho. I thought you'd be crying in a spa somewhere. And you brought your bodyguard. Simone walked to the head of the table, her movements precise. She didn't sit. She stood over Preston. Get out of my chair, she said, her voice clear and ringing. Preston blinked. Excuse me? The vote is in an hour. You're finished. Junho stepped forward, placing a thick leather folder on the table with a heavy thud. The vote has been cancelled, Junho said calmly. As the new majority shareholder of the holding company that owns your debt, Preston, I have restructured the board. You are no longer on it. The silence was absolute. Preston scrambled for the folder, flipping through pages, his face draining of color until he looked like wet dough. This is illegal, he stammered. This is a hostile takeover. Simone leaned down, her face inches from his, mirroring the intimidation he had tried to use on her. No, Preston, she smiled, cold and sharp. It's just business. Now, get out. You're staining the upholstery. 2 years later, the echo of that night still resonated, but the frequency had changed from anxiety to peace. It was morning, and the light streaming into the renovated loft was golden and thick with dust motes dancing in the air. The view from the floor-to-ceiling windows was still the city, but it no longer looked like a monster waiting to swallow her. It looked like a canvas she was helping to paint. The bank notifications on the phone sitting on the marble counter were no longer warnings of doom, but updates on the completion of the new solar grid housing project, a project that had saved the company and restored her father's name. Simone stood by the window, a mug of steaming coffee in her hands, coffee first, always coffee first, wearing one of Junho's oversized shirts that hung off her shoulder. She felt a pair of arms wrap around her waist from behind, solid and warm, anchoring her to the earth. She leaned back into him, resting her head against his chest, hearing the steady, strong beat of his heart. Thinking about the drop? Junho asked, his voice rough with sleep, pressing a kiss to the curve of her neck. He remembered everything. He always did. Simone smiled, turning in his arms to face him, tracing the sharp line of his jaw with her thumb. The shadows under her eyes were gone, replaced by the glow of a woman who was loved, seen, and victorious. No, she whispered, looking into his dark, soulful eyes. I was thinking about the landing. She stood on her tiptoes and kissed him, a slow, lingering seal on their partnership, their life, and their love. They had fallen, yes, fallen in love, fallen into a life they built from the wreckage of their pasts. And the landing? The landing was perfect. She looked directly at the invisible